Okay, now that we have collected or summarized the information that we've collected about the professional networking app that we're trying to create, please note that this is a brief example. So we didn't really collect all the information about the app, right? This is just a very brief example. If we are going to represent all the information, if we do a proper requirement elicitation and we want to have a proper summary of all the information, it would probably look much bigger than this mind map. You may, as you go through the studying the requirements you elicited and trying to understand them, you can reorganize your map as you go. Okay, this is just a brief example, so it's not complete and it's not as comprehensive as it should be. Just keep that in mind. Now let's say this is the app, this is the information that we've collected and we put here, summarize here. Let's try to create a data model based on our understanding there. So the data model is a simplified ERD or a simplified class diagram. Okay, so that eventually is going to evolve into a class diagram, and a class or an entity is a data holder. It represents the data structure that we want to have in our system. Okay, so based on our understanding, we can have a class that would represent profile. Okay, so that would be a data structure or a class that would naturally belong to our database or our class diagram. Okay, and there is the concept of a course that typically would belong to our database as well, or to our class diagram. Okay, and also we can recognize the concept of a job. Posting. Now there would be two types of relationships between the profile and the posting. So now we're not specifying detailed multiplicity or anything like that. Just generally speaking, there is some linking between this class or this entity and this general entity as well. So let's say the first type of relationship would be the posting. And the second type of relationship would be the applying. Now, see, obviously this like what we're talking about here is not so far from what we have represented here. Now, this is the summary of all the requirements, right? In a conceptual model. Now, it is natural that what we model here in the data model has a link or can be traced back to the data model, because I mean the domain model, because the domain model is just a summary of everything. Okay. All right, so now let's there's also a relationship between the profile and the course. So let's just generically call it takes. All right. So okay, we can say that this is at a high level. Okay. The first, I mean the first it's the first take of the level 0. Okay. Now let's see how can we break this down into level 2. So let's say the profile, we can expand it in order to add sub-entities to it. Now, when it eventually evolves to the class diagram or the entity class diagram, the sub-entities will be its own, like each of the sub-concept or the sub-entities that we're gonna represent here might end up its own table or its own class, right? But here we organizing the concept hierarchy. in a hierarchy so that we can evolve it without losing the bigger picture. Okay, so in a general big picture, we have the concept or the entity of the profile. Okay, and that entity of the profile have sub-concepts. So let's give it another color here. So that concept would be the personal profile. And there is the concept of the organization profile. Okay. Now, just what we're doing right now is just imagining how the class diagram or how the entity relationship diagram or how our database is gonna look like. So what are the data structure that we're gonna need to create? Okay. So we would have personal and organizational. So we can have a class called personal profile and a class called organization profile. Okay. So that's what we're aiming at. Okay. Now under personal, we might need to have sub-entities. Okay, so that represent so the concepts that are under or the entities or the classes that would naturally be under the profile concept. So under the profile, we can have degree, so that the list of degrees that is part of the education section of the profile. So when we talk about entity, so a degree, multiple of them, okay, and we can have a concept or an entity that is the employment. Okay, so we can imagine that we're gonna create a class called employment. Okay, this class may have multiple objects that are linked to a particular personal profile, or we can create a table called employment. That table would have multiple rows connected to another table or another row in a table called personal profile. Okay, so you see that's what we're trying to create here. Now we can have also, there is a concept, I mean, we can put it as a concept like this personal information. Now, whether we wanna think of it as an entity on its own, or maybe later on when we get to the implementation, we might decide to have it as just attributes of that personal class. If we keep the bigger concept as a class on its own, we can just have the personal information as entities, I mean as attributes. Okay, that's a decision we can have later. We can decide later. But there are also relationships between the organizations and the personal. So we can have some different types of relationships between the profiles. Okay, now there is the employment. If we started to think about the relationship between these two entities, let's say before we create these, so I'm gonna take these out for now. So let me put this away here. So we are still thinking at this level. There is an entity or a class called personal, and there is an entity or a class called organization. There are some relationships between these, right? So an organization may employ a personal. So, okay, so it employs a person, but in terms of the representation in the networking app, So the organization has an employee that has a personal account or a personal profile. So we can call this employee. Okay. And we can have a person or someone that has a personal profile following an organization. Maybe it's not an employee in that organization, but just follow it. So that's another type of relationships here. Okay. Okay, let me just do the opposite here. So I'm just gonna put this as the employee. So this is starting here. So this is employee. And this is the follow relationship. Okay. All right. Now let's also we can refine how these relationships worked. Now, before we get into the details inside the profile, we had the relationship post with profile and the relationship apply for the profile. Now that we have broken down the entity profile into personal and organization, we can say that this relationship actually goes to that sub-entity. Okay, so I'm just gonna change the color. And this relationship goes to that sub-entity. Now, that doesn't have to be the case all the time. So sometimes we need this. Well, so depend on relationship. So this is not, I mean, sometimes you can have the relationship that applies to all the sub-entities, so you can leave it up there. So if posts, like if personal employees or personal profiles can post a job, then you can leave this relationship link to the outer concept. Okay.